Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day two. We would certainly like to thank our sponsors who are on the screen for the opportunity to be here with you today. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to reflect on 4 items that have occurred since we saw you last. And many of these are commitments that we made last year that now have been fulfilled, and some of them are new items that we'll be talking about the way that our data is now making an impact in the industry. So, Remle?
All right. We're thrilled to be here to talk about something that we all love, data, of course. But I figured we should start off with some good news. This is a fabulous time to be in data. We have more data at our fingertips than ever before. We have patient-level data. We have intervention details. We even have outcomes. Things I couldn't have imagined when I started in EMS in the late 1900s on the paper tri-sheet. It's all here now. But with this also comes some bad news. And the bad news, of course, is we have more data at our fingertips than ever before. It often feels like we're swimming in data, maybe even drowning in it, totally overwhelmed. But not only are we drowning in the data, we're trying to boil the ocean more often than not. We're looking at all of the metrics all at once, everywhere in one giant spreadsheet. And it's really hard to make meaning out of it that way. But let me assure you, there is a better way. I've got a solution for us. And like many things, the solution is Legos. And by Legos, I mean data enablement. So let's take a journey through data enablement. We all start in the same spot. We've got this bucket of Legos poured out on the floor. That's your raw data. There's some colors. There might be something shiny in there, a different shape. You know there's something really cool in there. But how are we going to get it? The temptation might be to just put it all in a giant spreadsheet. That's like sweeping that Legos under the rug. Oh, and by the way, you're barefoot during this. Those of you with kids in your lives, I'm sorry for the trauma I just caused. All right, then some brave soul comes along, or maybe that person's not brave. Maybe they're just over-caffeinated. They sort your data. They put it into nice rows and columns. They start to figure out, maybe they even go a little bit Marie Kondo on it. Does this column spark joy? Nah, throw it out, drop, lots of nulls. Then we get to the point where we can arrange the data, starting to put it into patterns and detecting trends. Now we've hit a magic moment. This is what I call the bar chart moment. We've got our data presented visually with pretty colors. This is the moment when your stakeholders go, ooh, ah, wow. But your data analysts are in the corner. Please don't overinterpret this. But that's not where the real magic happens. The real magic happens with data enablement. This is where we have a story behind the data. We make sense of the data for the consumer of it. They not only know what the analysis says, they know what to do with it. That's the true data enablement. And that's where we're spending a lot of our time at ESO, developing data platforms that allow us to take that giant bucket of Legos spilled on the floor and turn it into the utensil holder that is actionable and useful and will drive meaningful change. Now, we've got our Lego house, but how do we know if that house is any good? A lot of us spend a lot of time on cardiac arrest. We try to improve our cardiac arrest care. We spend lots of effort on this, but how do we know if that effort actually moved the needle? Allow me to step onto a soapbox. I know a lot of folks will be, well, we'll compare ourselves to others. We'll do benchmarking. Now, why is this a soapbox for me? Because the way that we typically perform benchmarking in our industries is nothing short of a crime against data. I'm being dramatic. Maybe I'm not. Here we go. So let's take a look at a typical benchmark approach. First of all, we get our agency rate. ROSC is a really important cardiac arrest measure on the process measure to an outcome of neurologically intact survival. Fabulous. My agency's ROSC rate is at 28%. Is that good or bad? Well, what if I compare myself to the region? Other folks like me. Ooh, the regional average is at 27%. I'm good. All right, pat myself on the back, no action happens. Next quarter's report comes in. My agency rate's 27%. The regional average is at 28%. What do I do now? Despair. Oh no, everything's awful. We gotta spend more money. We gotta do something different. Maybe we don't do anything at all. We just cry. This is bad. There's a couple of things wrong with this approach to benchmarking. One of them is that I said the word average. Averages are often misleading. For example, on average, T. Swift and I have each spent 42 weeks at #1 on the Billboard. Don't let the boots fool you. And before you invite me to karaoke after Data After Dark tonight, let me assure you that when you average her 84 weeks and my 0, this is the misleading result. Averages are very sensitive to outliers, whereas medians like to stay put. So a median's a step up in the right direction, but should we really be shooting for mediocrity? To borrow from the great pioneer Jack Stout, how do I know if I'm cream of the crop or just cream of the crap? When it comes to benchmarking, we have some winners here. Average is on the podium, but nothing to get too excited about, especially if you have a small data set. Median is a step in the right direction, but there's an even better way. What does that look like? Here's some cardiac arrest data from the nation. It honestly doesn't matter which year I took this from, because it doesn't change very much over time. That line in the middle is the median. Woo, good job. But that line is at 10% survival, and it hasn't moved in a really long time. So if I get my data back and I see that, well, I'm doing 12% survival, that must be good, right? That's not the line that I would be paying attention to on this graphic. There's two lines, or two bars rather, where I would direct my attention. There's two agencies here, or organizations, systems, who are getting more than 2.5 times the national average. These are our top performers. These are the folks I want to talk to and figure out what are they doing well so that I can R&D it, rip off and duplicate. This is the approach that we want to take when we come to benchmarking. And to talk about how do we do performance improvement, how do we make measures that matter, I'm going to invite to the stage my good friend and an expert in quality improvement, Brooke Burton. And as she's coming up, I'm going to reveal something that some of you may have already gotten a sneak peek at. This has been out for a couple of weeks now in your Insights platform. But we have released what we call peak benchmarks for 4 of the global dashboards. This allows you to see, yes, the line of mediocrity is there, the median, but it also gives you what the top decile is doing. You can see 1 out of 10 high-performing agencies are achieving this metric and know that this is something that's doable. This is something we should be networking with our peers while we're here and learning what's going well. Examples, the peak benchmark on the fire decontamination board. The fire decontamination measure is one of our most critical measures as this really impacts human life. Our workforce in the fire industry often has cancer. Way to prevent cancer is by doing decontamination procedures. The exciting part in this peak benchmark is the top decile, 1 out of 10 agencies, is performing a decontamination procedure 100% of the time after a fire exposure. Another benchmark that we have in here with the peak levels on it is the NEMSQA Airway 18 measure. And I won't steal the thunder, we'll talk plenty about NEMSQA, but this is the National EMS Quality Alliance. And this measure is focused on a best practice of using not just capnography, a number, but waveform capnography for confirmation of advanced airways. And with that, I'm gonna pivot over and we're gonna have a conversation with our expert in quality improvement, Brooke Burton, and perhaps you can introduce yourself first.
Sure, thanks for having me. My name is Brooke Burton. I am the Quality Improvement Manager for Unified Fire Authority in Salt Lake County, Utah. And I have been working with NEMSQA pretty much since it started. It's been several years now. I am the president-elect, so working with the Measure Development Committee, the implementation committees. And what we do is we work to standardize performance measures. So your key performance indicators, we have all this data like Remle said, and we're finally saying, okay, let's start to look at this data in a standardized way. And then let's look at our performance of this data. And not only that, but we want to help you implement performance improvement from those indicators. So not just say, this is how we're doing, but what can we do to make it better, and how can we help each other collaboratively to make that happen?
So I don't think Dr. Jarvis is here to defend himself. So that gives us an opportunity to ask a question, which is, as you were creating the airway measures recently, obviously a couple of those were quite difficult to calculate on our side of the aisle.
Yes.
Help the audience kind of understand, why was that airway measure so important? And all joking aside with Dr. Jarvis, that is one of the greatest risks in the out-of-hospital environment, so it's great that we're doing that. But talk about how that measure got put together.
Well, when we put together any measure, we start with looking at the evidence that's out there. So we pull tons of research and try to evaluate, is this relevant? Is it important? Is it evidence-based? Is it something that's going to affect patient outcome? Is it really going to improve things for patients and make us more successful? So we do a big evidence review, and then we look at the feasibility. So are we able to get that information out of our data set? Are we able to easily grab that information and turn it into something actionable? And that one is a tricky one for this one, and the trickiest one that we've developed so far. So we have 21 measures at this time, and that one has been definitely the most challenging on that. But it's important because that measure looks at, is that person hypoxic when we're doing our airway intervention? So we've concentrated a lot on first pass success. But if I'm in there for my first pass for 5 minutes trying to get it on the first try, that's not what's best for the patient. So we really want to look at, in that before and after, are we doing a good job of keeping the patient oxygenated, setting everything up in a way so that when we go in and do that, it's quick and we're not causing patient decline.
And placing an advanced airway is one of those things that can be, in some systems, a low frequency, high criticality event. And on an individual scale, this means that looking at our data and making changes, it's going to be very difficult to know whether the changes we made resulted in actual improvement. And so in a case where there's a rare event, it makes sense oftentimes to pool our data together or to work in a collaborative. And I would like for you to talk a little bit about the quality improvement partnerships that are going on.
So I think that's the most exciting thing that NEMSQA is doing. And I want to give a shout out to Mike Tagman over here, because he's been running our airway collaboratives and has been doing a phenomenal job with that. Our first one was on red lights and sirens, and we talked a lot about that over the last couple of years. We had about 50 agencies participate in that across the country, all different agency types. And then over this last year, we've been working on airway improvements. So we have 3 measures that we're looking at around airway management. So, if you have an advanced airway, did you look at end tidal? Seems simple, but a lot of people aren't documenting that. And then the airway one that we just talked about around hypoxia. And if they were hypoxic, did they get oxygen? Again, these seem like simple things, but we're not doing very well with it if you look at our performance data. So those are the 3 that we decided to focus on. We have 60 agencies in this collaborative approximately, and they're all working together to try different change measures to see how can we improve. Is this a documentation problem? Is it an education problem? What are the things that people are seeing in their systems? What are they doing to facilitate improvement? And then sharing that across the collaborative. When that's done and we get a lot of good information from it, we'll put it out to everyone so that anyone in the nation can take that learning that we've done and improve your own system from it. We also have individual agency and association level members, so anyone can join NEMSQA and help develop these measures, give input on them, help us adjust them. Your agency can join as an agency. We have about, I think right now, around 85 agency members. If you're an individual or an agency member, would you just kind of throw your hand up there? Yeah, so some in there, you can grab some people and talk to them about their experience in the hall or later tonight. And then we also have states that are starting to join now. So we have about 14 states that have signed up as state level members who want to do improvement at the state level and collaborate with us that way as well. So that's pretty exciting. When we talked about benchmarking being a problem, Brene Brown's one of my favorites, and she says that comparison is the killer of creativity and joy. So I think we really have to work more collaboratively instead of comparing ourselves with other people.
Well said. I think we have hit our time on this, but I will give you one opportunity, one last question. If you have one piece of advice for agencies here who are going into insights, looking at their data and thinking about how should I approach making a meaningful change, what advice would you give them to get started?
Yeah, I would say to get started, just do something. So pick the low-hanging fruit and just do something that's easy, that can kind of get your motivation and your ball rolling, and that will, be some kind of effect, even if it's something small, because that's something that you can build on. The not doing anything is kind of what the problem is, right? I'm looking at my data, I don't even know where to start, I'm just gonna ignore it.
I couldn't agree more. Analysis paralysis.
Just do something.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thanks for having me.
For our next module in this fun-packed keynote, we're going to be talking about patient-centered care. Now, the EMS Vision 2050, some of you may have read this document. If you haven't, you definitely should. This was released in 2019, and it is the vision for the future. How do we want EMS to look? And the way that we want EMS to look is as a people-centered system of care, where we are putting patients in the middle of everything we do. We're providing care that's not only safe and effective, but that is equitable. And so traditionally, EMS encounters are not set up to follow this EMS vision today. Our EHR records have historically been activation-based. So for each unit that I send to a call, I fill out a record, and that record is disparate from other units that were on that call, and that is definitely disparate from other calls that patient may have had. Until now, bum, bum, bum. The longitudinal record is an innovation that has allowed us to move towards this vision for the future. Now we can have patients at the center of the record and watch that patient throughout the continuum of care. We can see not only what happens to them in the pre-hospital environment, but what happens to them in the hospital environment through health data exchange, and then what happens to them on subsequent encounters. And with this brings a lot of questions around what if we could?
This is probably the most exciting research to me that we have done in the past year. The ability to look across the system and see not episodes of care, but patient-centered views. And there's a couple of things that come from that. The first is we can now quantify what many of us have had the notion anecdotally exists, which is patients are calling us frequently in the community. What we know now is that 3% of patients create 16% of the EMS volume. Let me say that again. 3% of patients create 16% of the EMS volume. And I think what was surprising to me is those ultra-high utilizers are actually more likely to be transported than the general population that calls EMS. Exactly why that is a great thing for us to talk about at the bar later, right? There's a lot of different hypotheses about why that is, but one of those may be that your EMS providers just don't want to go through the process of doing something different, so let's just get an ambulance and go to the hospital, right? And we've seen that group move along, but they're much more likely, and it's 3% of patients create 16% of the volume. The other way of looking at this is the number that's always bothered me is we say 11% of the population or 9% of the population, somewhere in there, calls EMS every year for an ambulance. That seems preposterous, right? There's no way that 9% of the population has a time-critical medical emergency every year. That just doesn't happen, right? Well, in point of fact, it's not 9% of the population that calls. It's more like 6% of the population, because 81% of the people call EMS one time a year, right? So 80% of the time that they call once. 19% of the people call more than once. But what's interesting is how this impacts your volume, right? And this is the new fun stuff. And thanks, April, for this wicked cool slide. So 81% call once a year, but that's only 57% of your volume. In other words, 57% of the time you are going to a unique once-a-year medical emergency. Conversely, those 19% of patients create 43% of your volume. So 43% of the time you're rolling, you are going to see somebody that's already called at least once in the past year. This, I think, helps inform our policy. For the first time, we can actually advocate at the state, local, and national level to really understand who is utilizing EMS and how we might be able to change this curve, or at least be able to handle the increased volume that comes from all of this. Because all of us, I think, are encountering those level zeros or very few units available, and 43% of the time we're going to repeat customers. There's got to be a way for us to balance this and still have equitable care. And there you can see the numbers of those. The other piece, I'm gonna hand it back to Remle, is not only can we look at this over time, with insights reporting, you can gauge how often you want to see this, and we're gonna look at 72-hour returns.
Absolutely. So one of the things that keeps us up at night is the concept of a high-risk non-transport. I don't like to use the word refusal. It's really hard to figure out who initiated a refusal, but high-risk non-transport. Previously, we haven't been able to know this at scale. How often are we returning to a patient who we have seen within the last 72 hours? Now we have a baseline piece of data here that 6% of patients we will be returning to within 72 hours. The interesting piece of this is we also, separately from here, looked at transports. We returned to about 3% of patients that we transported on that initial index encounter. But it is important to look at what happens to these patients. Even the 6% of non-transports who we return to, about 71% of those end up transported at their subsequent encounter. Again, there's no is this good or bad here, but this is a baseline from which to work. If we look at our system and we see, oh, my rate of return is 11%, now I know that I can go start to explore what are the drivers behind that 11%, what makes me different from the national measure.
I think the other important piece off this slide is you note about 1% of patients are pulseless on EMS arrival, give or take, and it's the same on the return.
Yes.
So I know when I was the medical director at Wake, I was quite worried about patients that didn't go to the hospital and they were going to call back and they were all going to have CPR in progress, right? And in point of fact, that's not the case. They are no different on the return than they're on the other. And I want to emphasize what Remle said. Going to the hospital does not mitigate a 72-hour return, right? You have a 3% 72-hour return rate even if transported to the emergency department. So it gives you that benchmark, if you will, to start thinking about how the system works. And if you put these two together, I think it gives us a really interesting way to approach the community. So with that, we're going to ask Dr. Calhoun from Cincinnati Fire Department to come join us. He was at the MD Summit 2 years ago and was, how shall we say, enthusiastic about the ability to have a 72-hour return report. And so it may have taken us a little bit longer, but I think we have a 72-hour return report now. We can talk about that.
We do, and in fact, we'll give you a little sneak peek to a talk that's going to be happening on Thursday on the EMS Index for 2025. So some of you may have noticed this dashboard is out live now in Insights, but this is the look at repeat patient encounters. And this is one of our focuses for 2025 Index. So I won't steal all of Dr. Fernandez's thunder on this, but definitely make sure to check it out. Turn to you.
Well, I appreciate the term enthusiastic. Whiny is what people usually say.
I wasn't going to say that in public. So as we think about designing a system and putting these two metrics together, right? One is we know these 3% of patients creating 16% of the volume. Two, we know that 6% of patients call back within 72 hours. How do you use those two to think about equity, designing a system, appropriately treating patients that are ultra-high utilizers?
Sure. So I think this metric is really interesting to me because it has utility for everybody's system. A lot of the really nice new advances, you have to have really done a lot of the fundamental work to really be able to utilize those. There is the 72-hour return, I think, is a very fundamental part of medical direction and quality management, whereas the high utilizer aspect can, depending on your system, be sort of more the as we're advancing, as we're getting further. So in our system, we are finally to the point where we're starting to be able to really address the high utilizer aspect of it, to the point where we're actually in the process of trying to hire a social worker to be able to really dig into not just, yes, you keep coming, I'm going to make a visit to your house and talk to you about this and try and advise that you not do this, or come up with some almost seemingly punitive protocol where we're going to show up and if you don't meet XYZ criteria, we stop showing up. I'm going to be able to really integrate that data into finding the root cause of your issue and trying to address that. And we're not unique to that. There are some systems. San Diego has an amazing process that we're trying to model upon to do that using this data that we're going to be able to pull out from ESO.
And I think there's a really important part of what you just said, which is this has to be equitable care, right? There was a great editorial, it's now been 15 years ago, but the editorial basically said we should stop asking why people access the healthcare system through 911. The question is, why would you access it any other way? This is the easiest way. It will be there in 8 minutes. We'll come fix your problem. Why would you not call, right? And so I think it is a mind shift for us to say there's a high utilizer group and we need to do well by them. And it may be a different set of tools, but it's not a punitive protocol. That's a really important component of that.
Oh, and the view that, we got into EMS to go to dead people and people who couldn't breathe and people who needed plastic in their airway, and that was our purpose, and if you call us for something else, is archaic. And anybody who's sort of holding on to that and that's their purpose in getting to EMS is really missing the boat to what they really said in their interview they wanted to do, which was to help people. And we will help more people using this than we will a laryngoscope every day of the week.
Indeed. Other things that you are thinking about following, say, the 72-hour return. What is your protocol? What do you do for a patient that does call back? What are the metrics that say it was a miss or it was okay for the call? How do you
Sure.
look at that?
So the 72-hour, we actually modified a little bit and try and use a 48. I don't know why we chose 48. But I use this as a screening tool. So this isn't I look at the data and I'm happy with it or I'm unhappy with it. This is Dustin Calhoun is extremely lazy. So I need some way of filtering. I'm sure I'm unique in that both I'm lazy and I don't have enough resources in my system to look at every run, right? I'm the only one in the room that has that problem. So we use this to filter. So the ones that really want to catch my eye are, we went to them, we didn't transport them, we go back to them and we do transport them, and they're not a typical high utilizer. So that is it raises a red flag to, I want someone, me or someone else in the team, digging into that run to see if we made an error, to see if there is something in our process. Maybe it is that one unique provider who's just hit their burnout level and we need to catch that. Or maybe it is something in our system, a mentality, a culture issue, or some sort of systemic issue that we need to address to try to catch that patient next time, because that's the patient that we have the potential to harm, the patient that we were the last one to touch.
Great.
I think we've got time for one more.
Sure.
All right. I'm curious about the high utilizer groups, those very high utilizers. What are your thoughts on change ideas for how do we address that population and meet them with the right resource? If they're going to the emergency department multiple times per month, that might not be the right resource for them.
I mean, the first question is why? And really honestly asking that question. I'm as guilty as everyone else. I have stood with my fire captain in front of two patients who use the EMS system all the time and said, why is it that you're coming? And then basically that info went in one ear, out the other, and we said, you really need to stop doing this. You can only go to one hospital, and we're gonna try and push this off onto the hospital. If we make it their problem, they'll fix it. We really have to sit with an open mind and resources. That's the other thing, is tying this data to resources that can help. And that's why we're pulling in a social worker. We're admitting that we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to figure out what is the resource that's going to fix the problem that's leading you to do something that I have no doubt there are very few people who really want to call EMS every day, but there are some people that feel that they have to because they have no other option, and that's what we've got to figure out.
I think that's a great place to begin, is with the curiosity and being willing to step outside of our silos to find solutions that are out of the box.
Great. Thanks, Dustin.
Thank
Appreciate it. So we've talked about two things that are available to you today, right? You can go look at your pink benchmarking. You can go look at the return report within Insights today. All of those are live. What we're going to talk about for the next little bit is what's coming really soon and some ways that we are using data to actually ask and answer important questions. So if we think about the data that are available to us, historically in medicine, this has been the way that things are done. There are discrete episodes of research. We do the basic lab research, then we'll do the clinical research, and then we'll do the implementation research. And these trials are time delineated, right? We're going to do this for 3 months, we're going to do this for 6 months, and you do these things in an order. If you are doing this in a hospital, it's somewhat easier than doing it in the field. And as a matter of fact, what we know is that there's a dearth of quality research in the out-of-hospital environment because each of these is so difficult to do in the out-of-hospital environment. One of the reasons it's difficult to do is that you have to have, historically, someone at each of the receiving hospitals to gather the data on the outcomes, find out what happened to your patient, and conduct all of these trials. Our view here is that we now have sufficient data to change this paradigm. This paradigm is no longer do a trial, do a trial, do a trial, but rather we are a constant learning platform. Because we know what happens at dispatch, we know what happens in first response, in the field, in the hospital, through the registry, we can constantly monitor what is going on in the field, what's working, what's not working. And the goal here is something that I'll have Dr. Nickel come up in just a minute and talk about a platform trial. This notion of a constant research platform that you can just come and ask and answer whatever questions you want to ask and answer. And so the beauty of that is that we as EMS providers, as firefighters, as emergency physicians, are going to be able to constantly know if what we're doing is actually working. And we can all go back and name all the things that we thought looked good in one of those incremental trials, and then once we put it in the field, it had totally opposite outcomes, right? There's a few in the room that still remember 10 milligrams of epinephrine. That'll get a pulse out of the table, right? But the problem is, of course, patients don't survive to the outcome of interest, which is what we're now able to do. So I'm going to ask Dr. Nickel to come up while I talk about a publication, and this is where the people at ESO get nervous. Those that know me know that I write slides as I'm coming up on the stage, generally speaking. And this particular trial, we held this because it was published literally last week. And this was in JAMA Open, and it was asking a pretty simple question that's important, which is for cardiac arrest outcome, does being in a rural versus an urban area, does being in an area of socioeconomic deprivation versus no, independently impact your outcome? And that's an important question. And by the way, to get to the punchline there, if you are in the urban area in a socioeconomic deprived environment, that does independently predict a worse probability of neurologically intact outcome. So rural area didn't do it, urban socioeconomic deprivation did prove it. That's the outcome of the paper. What's important for our discussion, however, is there were no research assistants at every one of these receiving hospitals. There was no huge trial that had to be set up. Because we know not only what the diagnosis was, we know where the patient went from the hospital. Did they go home? Did they go to skilled nursing? Did they go to long-term acute care? We could infer their neurologically intact survivability by their disposition from the hospital. And so from that, we then now have the ability to ask and answer a bunch of questions, not just in cardiac arrest, but in trauma and elsewhere in a continuous fashion. And so, Dr. Nickel, if you want to introduce yourself, then we'll talk about what a platform trial actually is.
Thanks, Brent. I'm Graham Nickel. I practice emergency medicine at Harborview in Seattle and do clinical research through the University of Washington.
Great. So what is a platform trial? It seems simple, but it can be a complicated concept.
Sure. A platform trial is a framework for continuous randomization. And so you might start out by randomizing patients with a particular condition, often cardiac arrest, to one drug or another. And historically, it has been very burdensome for the medics and the agencies and the hospitals to do one trial, answer the question, stop, train for the new trial, and move forward. But a platform trial really is an effort to move to continuous randomization. So we might start out by randomizing to different drugs in cardiac arrest. Over time, we accumulate data, look at it, and decide that we know that drug B is not working. So we stop randomizing patients to standard care versus drug B, but we immediately, or as close to immediately as possible, randomize to standard care versus drug C. And by always randomizing, it is much less burdensome on the EMS providers. It's also much less burdensome on EMS medical directors in the hospitals. And it is somewhat, we believe, it is somewhat less immune to some of the things that are going on nationally with healthcare research funding.
So as we think about this in a community, a vision would be that this is set up all the time.
Correct.
Right? And that not only, so let's say drug B becomes the clear winner.
Right.
Then across the entire ecosystem, we can monitor drug B to make sure that implementation is the same as it was in the randomized trial.
Right.
And how do we as an industry think about communicating this to our communities? because they're going to get in this exception from performance consent and so forth. And in my mind, this protects us more from that because we are honestly monitoring the community all the time, not just during the trial.
Right. Well, it does require continuously working with the community. Many of you are already doing that. That has been a challenge in the past, but we have adopted the approach of using the same methods of community consultation in each center, which makes it easier. It also, as I said, by having the paramedics or EMTs continuously randomizing the patient, it becomes incorporated into their daily work. So over time, we expect they will have to think less about, does this patient qualify? Are we doing drug A versus B, or what are we doing this week? It's the easier we make it for the providers, the more we will be able to do this on a perpetual basis.
Great. Remle?
Yeah, so I think some of us have not participated in a randomized control trial, and for me, what is so exciting about this is how it overcomes so many of the traditional barriers in an RCT. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of the traditional barriers and what this is going to allow us to do.
Sure. Where shall I start?
I was about to say, we only have like 2 minutes.
It's pretty challenging to develop an idea, put the team together, get the funding, do the training, collect the data, answer the question, and then you stop. And until the next question has been developed and is funded, you have to start all over again. And my sense is the ebbs and flows, or the mountains and valleys, are really challenging. What we're really trying to do is flatten out the mountain so that we're always engaged in research. And in some sense, we're working to transition to the participating EMS agencies being part of a learning health system, which ultimately will help all our patients.
Great.
Continuous compressions, better than stopping and starting.
Right.
Right, exactly. So for those in the audience that are interested, find us in the corner, and we'll talk about how we're going to think about the next steps in this, because this is an important piece for us. The ability as an industry to know what's going on, not just during the trial, but all the time, is just so appealing, I think, to all of us in the room. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. The last one of the day is one of the most exciting things that we've done in the past year since we last spoke with you all. We have integrated, as you know, EMS and ED data across the country, and we've spent 2024 improving process. We went into the match algorithm, and many of you remember the days where you had to scan an armband or manually enter data, that kind of thing. And throughout 2024, we transitioned our healthcare facilities to an automated match system where no manual effort is required. And that has more than doubled our match rate. As a matter of fact, while we are here, we are matching a record across the country every 10 seconds. And during the time that we're together, we will match about 360 records just while we're here added to that data set. And for those of you that can do spreadsheet math, you'll start figuring out that that's about 450,000 records a month, or about 5.2 million records a year that will be matched from dispatch all the way through to discharge. That allows us to enter into the concepts that we just talked about. The other thing that it allows us to do is to think about how we're going to predict the future for a patient or a group of patients. And for those that don't practice in the hospital, there are a couple of things that happen every time somebody goes to the emergency department. One of those is that you're assigned an ESI score. And for those that haven't worked in the emergency department, it's very similar to what you might get from dispatch. If you're medical priority, you're very familiar with Omega through Echo. ESI is very similar in that it's just numeric. It's 1 to 5. Ones are really easy. CPR in progress, gunshot wound to the chest, I can assign an ESI 1 pretty well all day long. ESI 5s are pretty easy too, right? There are healthy people with toe fungus, easy, ESI 5. The trick is getting the distinction between an ESI 2 and ESI 3. And those patients, the probability of deterioration if they go to the waiting room, as an example, is markedly different between a 2 and a 3. And so it's incredibly important for us, if we think about who's going to be left on the scene, you don't want to leave what would be an ESI 1 or 2 on the scene. Conversely, if you're going to go to telemedicine, you would love to know who's in ESI 5 or in ESI 4, so you've selected that population appropriately. What has not been done at scale is to look and say, does EMS data have the same predictive properties as data gathered in the emergency department around ESI? So before we leave today, we're going to answer that question for you. The other thing that comes is that we really need to detect acute disease processes, stroke and sepsis being the two that we don't do very well, not just from an EMS perspective, but also throughout the house of medicine, right? There's a really difficult time in detecting sepsis, so we need tools to help us find that. We published a couple of years ago this notion that EMS misses about 80% of sepsis, right? Because it's a relatively common event for the patient population, but it's a unique event for that individual paramedic that arrives, and it's hard to detect. However, if you do detect sepsis, you can measurably decrease that patient's mortality. Now, this is a retrospective trial, so we can't put causation, but there's sure a signal here that mortality is reduced if EMS recognizes sepsis and treats it in the field. So it's an important thing for us to find. The converse is the thing that we're worried about, right? Which is sometimes you put these models in the field and they don't work as well as you thought they would. So our commitment to you is that we are going to be very particular as we walk down this path to start the concept of bedside decision support. That's where we're headed, but we're going to walk with you there and show you the strengths and the weaknesses of what we do. So with that, I'm going to ask Christian Riley from MedNation to come to the stage. And as he's coming up, I'll tell you a little bit about what MedNation does, and he can correct me if I say it wrong. But the gist of it is today, MedNation works in the emergency departments, assisting the nursing staff as they do assign triage, detect sepsis, et cetera. What we've done over the past year in an IRB-approved, soon-to-be-published trial is rather than use emergency department data, take EMS data and run it through this algorithm and see, can it predict the ESI score? Can it help detect sepsis? So Christian, I think we'll just have a seat here and kind of go through what we found from that. If you want to, anything else about MedNation that I left out or anything else you want to tell the audience, then we'll jump into the results.
MedNation is hard to pronounce. We prefer people just refer to it as Kate AI. That seems to be easy to remember for our 42 live customer sites where Kate is predicting risk of decompensation 24/7.
Great. So we put the EMS data right beside the ED data, put it through the algorithm, and this is what we found. So what are we seeing here?
So we've been running Kate continuously. We've got about 3 million predictions on triage. The team of clinicians that we've assembled to help enable the model to be as perfect as possible to the ESI standard, which is the gold standard, is really good at that differentiation on the ESI 2-3 boundary. And when it was developed, we have the original author of the standard on the team. We have the head of research from ENA, Lisa Wolf, on the team, and a bunch of ED experts that are, right.
And that's Emergency Nurses Association, for those that don't know what the ENA is. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Brent. And we use it to help, the lobby is the worst place in the emergency room. You don't want to be in the lobby with sepsis. And so we help the nurses detect that pre-lab, as well as stroke and every possible combination of disease that comes in through the door. And so we applied that algorithm on your EMS data at one site where you service the hospital in Bakersfield. And what we found was there was a really strong correlation of just using the data from that EMS collected and making the same exact prediction for high-risk patients. There was 99% overlap where we detected a high-risk condition that was a risk of decompensation. We were quite surprised how similar the data is and similar the processes are between what EMS does and what the nurse does in triage at the hospitals.
So EMS didn't have to do anything differently, but I do recall as we were analyzing these data, there was a unique component of EMS is that there were multiple vital signs, which did not occur at triage. So talk to us about the importance of that. How do you handle this multiple vital sign situation, and how did it either enhance or not enhance the data?
So on average, there's about 4 vital signs per patient. Some of the high water mark was around 10. Very few had just 1. And so we basically took the data that was collected and created a unique prediction record for each set of vital signs, and then selected the majority outcome for this analysis.
Great. So I also want to talk about the ability to detect sepsis. And as we know, humans don't do very well. So any help is help. But what are we seeing here as far as the way that the EMS data versus the hospital data for the detection of sepsis?
So first, let me say that Kate AI was recognized by the FDA with a breakthrough designation for early sepsis recognition. That was a big compliment for the hard work of the team to build a model that had high sensitivity and specificity for detecting sepsis before any laboratory results are measured or any other diagnoses are taken. And so we have about a 74% detection rate of sepsis with a 4.5% false positive rate for sepsis in triage at hospitals. And so we're doing great work there, and we wondered, how well does that translate to the same patient in the EMS part of their journey, and it was near equal. The overlap of the data collected showed that you can detect sepsis in pre-arrival mode. There's lots of point of care stuff coming out that can enhance that, but we think that the algorithm generalizes to the field.
That's great news. And I think this ties back to the conversation at the keynote yesterday. Having an ambient listening capability, because you can't have bedside decision support if you don't have bedside data. And so the ability to enter data automatically in the background, no effort on the part of the provider, I think is the key to get us there. What are your thoughts on how quickly we could make these decisions if the data were made available at the bedside?
I agree. Nurses are pretty terse. They may write one sentence of highly dense information, PT, CO, NVD, X3 days, HX, AFib.
We have no bodyguard for you on your way off the stage.
And EMS is a little bit more verbose. There's a lot of people involved, and there's a story there around the family, the event, where they were found. But the clinical concepts that are written are pretty darn close. And so you don't need much of a story to add to the discrete data like vital signs and assessments and ROSC, et cetera, be fast negative. All those concepts are pretty standard. So I would advocate strongly for ambient listening to summarize the clinical observations and assessments that are made in the field. ENA has been working really hard with emergency nurses across the nation to up-level triage and the clinical assessments that come along with a presentation. No longer do they want just abdominal pain documented. Because I got 12 abdominal pains in the waiting room, which one's gonna have, an aortic dissection, a AAA? Which one is appendicitis, right? So I think the industry as a whole is working to really round out the clinical picture, and ambient listening is gonna help a lot.
Great. Emily, any?
I think we're at a very exciting moment, innovation in data, using AI as an adjunct for decision support, but I don't want to lose sight of the human aspect of change. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what it was like when Kate first made her way into the hospital. I can't imagine that the clinicians were overly excited that the robot was going to tell them how to do their jobs. And maybe there's some pitfalls there that we can avoid as we move towards curbside decision-making in EMS.
I have a great story. We went to our first site, White Memorial Hospital in central Los Angeles, after we did a research project there. And they're a community-based education hospital, right? They pull new nurses and physicians in from the community. So they're a very tight family. Our playbook was to listen to the clinicians and not even bother them if everything was great. We only alert clinicians when we see something headed in the wrong direction. So the first page was stay out of the way of the clinicians and just help them. Don't tell them what to do. And then we had a big feedback loop with registered nurses who met monthly and quarterly with them to show them data, to show them how it was helping them improve identification of stroke patients, of high-risk diabetic patients, which is part of their population. And so that feedback loop of data to help people, I think, is the most important.
Absolutely.
I'm
Thank you,
speaking
Brent.
to your heart.
You are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
So as we wrap up this morning, there are things that are available to you, right? Peak benchmarking is available in Insights right now for you. Please take advantage of that. Give us feedback on the next measures you'd like to see. The longitudinal record is live not only in the field for the medic, but now in your Insights platform to see how many times you have patients come back to see you. This research platform idea is here to stay. That publication last week is a really powerful demonstration of the ability of our data to ask and answer questions. And as we told you all along, we are going to walk with you for clinical decision support. We're not going to just throw something out there and say, good luck, this is how it goes. And so I think as we think about where we're going to be standing here next year and doing the update, this is our commitment to you, is that we are in the world of AI. There is no reason to fight against that, and we're going to have these conversations over the year. But we are not going to replace your decision-making. We're going to support everything that comes forward with evidence from our own data so that you know it's EMS-based data. It's not data that came from the ICU or the CCU or what have you. And we're going to be really clear about the limitations. Some of these are going to be really strong, and you should rely on them very heavily. Some of these are going to be mere suggestions. Have you thought about this? We don't know if it's there or not. But it's never going to be a diagnostic tool, right? Our goal is always to give you decision support, but not to take that away from you. Remle, any final thoughts?
Absolutely. One of the things that keeps me up at night about something like incorporating AI is the potential for unintended consequences. We do not want to create a weapon of mass destruction where we bring in inequitable data and we exacerbate inequities. So we are taking a very thoughtful approach and making sure that these models function equitably across populations as well.
Great. Well, I hope you have a great day at WAVE, and we look forward to seeing you at Data After Dark later tonight. So have a great day, and thank you all very much.
Absolutely.